Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 5, where we're going to cover the Battle of Okinawa. Let me get the PowerPoint presentation organized here so that we're all able to share in this. And let's see, we got to put this on full screen and then get rid of this little thing. All right. Okay. So I think we're all set. Oh, I got to turn my video on. That's an important aspect of this. Okay, good. All right. So I think we're all set. Again, welcome to week 5 of the seminar on the war in the Pacific. We're, as I said, going to talk about the Battle of Okinawa, which was the last major island invasion before the planned invasion of the home islands of Japan. As you think about the war at this point in 1945, one of the enduring controversies at that time and afterwards was whether America was justified in dropping the atomic bomb as a way to bring the war to an end and to avoid the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. Now, that debate will go on forever, but today we're going to try to put ourselves in the position of America's leaders and the position that they found themselves in and try to see the situation as they saw it through their eyes. So today we're going to talk about this Battle of Okinawa and the harsh and brutal lessons that the American military took from it. And you can decide for yourself, after hearing about the carnage on Okinawa, whether or not you think Truman and his advisors made the right decision to drop the atomic bomb. Or, as some would say, was the atomic bomb really a pox on American history? One thing that you have to definitely keep in mind as you think about the war in the Pacific is that the carnage only got worse and worse with each invasion of each island as we were nearing the Japanese home islands. Let's for a moment just review what we heard last week about Saipan, a brutal 3-week campaign that had occurred from June 15th, 1944 through July 9th of 1944. It resulted in more than 3,500 US deaths and more than 13,000 wounded. For their part, the Japanese lost more than 27,000 soldiers killed. Nearly the entire garrison of Japanese perished in the fight, minus a few hundred who, when captured, were badly wounded or unconscious or both. In July, when the US declared that the battle was over, around 7,000 of Saipan citizens, terrified by the Japanese propaganda that warned them that they would be killed by US troops, they actually leapt to their deaths from the high cliffs at the island's northern end. In total, in the Saipan campaign, more than 22,000 civilians died. Many of them took up arms and charged the American lines, but Japanese children, on top of the adults that were charging the American lines, were often found approaching American soldiers carrying a hand grenade behind their back. It was completely shocking. When it was over, only 900 Japanese citizens were left alive on Saipan, and they were the ones who were surrendering. Now, offshore, the carnage amongst the US naval troops was nearly as bad as it was onshore. More than 100 ships were sunk or heavily damaged in the fight. Saipan also saw a change in the way the Japanese war was being reported on the home front. And that brings us to the man who, let's get to the PowerPoint, the man who was the prime minister at the time, Prime Minister Hideko Tojo. Initially, as the battle started, Japanese accounts concentrated on the fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Army and the heavy casualties it was inflicting on the American forces. But the battle went so badly for Japan that Prime Minister Tojo, who had pushed for the war and promised that no American would ever get close to Japan, was forced to resign on July the 18th, 1944. Once he was out, the Japanese press began publishing a day-to-day account of what was happening on Saipan. And both the Army and the Navy were finally forced to admit how bad things had become. The media mentioned the near total loss of all the Japanese soldiers and civilians on the island and the use of, as what they called them, human bullets. These were people that they were using as bullets. Suicides had been encouraged as the imperial way. Even after the official end of the battle on July the 9th, Japanese resistance still persisted. 46 soldiers and their captain, who had survived the final banzai charge, disappeared into the jungle for the purpose of conducting a guerrilla campaign. Now, American Marines were sent out to try to hunt them down, and they went out numerous times, but they failed to be able to find the caves in which they were hiding. They never managed to find them for several months. In September of 1944, the Marines still hadn't found these people who were hiding out in the interior of the island and attacking the Americans that were left behind on the island. They kept raiding the American camps for supplies and trying to kill as many Americans as they could. Still, the Americans couldn't find them. They held out all winter and for the entirety of 1945. They finally surrendered on December the 1st, 1945, 3 months after the official surrender of Japan. So they kept fighting until December of 1945. Now, Emperor Hirohito personally was issuing directives during the Battle of Saipan and afterwards. Both the military and civilians, he said, should all commit suicide for the benefits in the afterlife, where they could continue to serve the emperor. These were his words. Now, where have we heard all of this before? Doesn't it sound a little like the Taliban and others who are always hell-bent on suicide bombing, right? It's the same mentality. Now, after the war, in this particular case, apologists for Hirohito went so far as to assert that the order encouraging this behavior had been forged, that it wasn't really Hirohito that had ordered it, but that these orders had been forged so as not to incriminate Hirohito in war crimes. This was the experience in Saipan. So when planning began for the invasion of Okinawa, everyone from the cooks on the ships to the admirals knew that it was going to be a complete bloodbath. And they were all actually wrong about that. It wasn't a complete bloodbath. It was actually way worse. So here's a map of the island of Okinawa. You'll see in the lower right here where my cursor is, it shows its general location, which is southwest of the home islands of Japan, between Taiwan, which is here, and Japan, which is up here. This is the location that we're going to be talking about. The battle began on April the 1st and officially ended on June 22nd of 1945. 82 days of what would become World War I style carnage, with suicide bombers, including Japanese children acting as suicide bombers, thrown in for good measure. Both the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army would fight side by side against the Imperial Japanese Army and a horde of civilian conscripts. A fight to the death, every day and every night. 250,000 American combat troops would see action on Okinawa, with an additional 250,000 more waiting in the wings in anticipation that they might be called upon to join the fight as replacements for the first 250,000. That's how bad they thought it was going to be. Against the American forces, there were 76,000 Japanese soldiers with another 20,000 civilian conscripts pulled out of the local population. When the dust finally settled, 20,000 Americans lay dead. 20,000. Think about that figure. The entire Vietnam War resulted in around 50,000 killed. The war on terror that we've been fighting since 9/11 has resulted in about 4,500 Americans killed. So the Battle of Okinawa cost America 4 to 5 times the total number of killed since 9/11. 4,500 is already a huge sacrifice. But how about 5 times that number for an island that few, if any, had ever heard of? This is the story of Okinawa. Of the 96,000 official Japanese soldiers and conscripts, only 7,000 were captured. 89,000 were killed. The numbers are shocking. Way worse, here's a number to keep in mind. The population of Okinawa before the invasion was around 300,000 people. These were ethnic Japanese that were living on Okinawa at the time. After the battle was over, the population was reduced to 150,000. The other 150,000 were either killed fighting with the Japanese soldiers, committed suicide, or just disappeared in the cannon fire. This is the story of Okinawa. The losses are staggering. On the American side, 220 tanks, 12 destroyers, 15 amphibious ships, 9 other ships sunk, 386 ships damaged, including 2 carriers, the Franklin and the Bunker Hill, the loss of 780 planes, 5,000 Navy men lost, 4,800 wounded, and 15,000 Army and Marines lost, and 30,000 wounded. The 5,000 naval soldiers were all lost to kamikazes that were attacking the ships offshore. It's a staggering number, 5,000 from kamikazes alone. But the Japanese numbers are just as bad, if not worse. The Japanese lost a battleship, a cruiser, 5 destroyers, 9 other warships, 1,400 aircraft, which were mostly used as kamikazes. Whatever tanks they had on the island were destroyed. All of their artillery pieces, and these 89,000 soldiers, not to mention half the population of the island of Japan, of Okinawa. Totally shocking numbers. The invasion of Okinawa on April the 1st, 1945, turned out to be the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. And after a long campaign of island hopping, the Allies were planning to use this Kadena air base as a large, on the island as a base for Operation Downfall, which was in fact the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, which were only 340 miles away to the northeast. The United States, for the invasion, it created something that they called the 10th Army, and it consisted of the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions of the U.S. Army, along with the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Divisions of the Marine Corps, all to fight on the island. The 10th was unique in that it had its own tactical air force, a joint Army-Marine command, and was also supported, of course, by the combined naval and amphibious forces offshore. The close cooperation between the ground forces and the air power was a real innovation developed by Marines and naval aviators who figured out that the ground troops should be able to talk directly to the planes above them. Forward observers were calling in bombs and rockets and gunfire to suppress enemy positions directly in front of the advancing Americans. Now, the Germans had been doing this for the entire war in Europe, but we only figured out how to make that work in late 1944, and we figured it out in the Pacific. But as you would expect, it worked very well, and it soon found its way to all the battlefronts, and also including British and Canadian troops as well. By the time Okinawa happened, it was working very well. The battle has been referred to as the Typhoon of Steel, interestingly in both English and in Japanese. The nickname actually refers to the carnage, the ferocity of the fighting, the intensity of the Japanese kamikaze attacks, and the sheer number of Allied ships and armored vehicles that assaulted the island. In command was this man, General Simon Bolivar Buckner. It was planned that General Simon Bolivar Buckner, whose father was a famous Confederate general from the Civil War, would report to Admiral Kelly Turner until the amphibious phase was completed, after which he would report directly to Admiral Spruance, who we learned about last week. Turner was the admiral who was in charge of organizing the Allied invasion fleets of landing craft and offshore bombardments. Turner did this job for nearly the entire Pacific War and built a stellar reputation for his organizational skills. Now, the U.S. in Okinawa had more than 3,000 aircraft that they could call on, including fighters, attack aircraft, scout planes, bombers, and dive bombers, all assigned to Okinawa. So we showed up there with overwhelming force. By this time of the war, the British had already recovered enough from carrying the war in Europe to be able to send a naval contingent to the Pacific to join the battle. They arrived at Okinawa with a large fleet that included another 251 British naval aircraft. It also included other British Commonwealth ships from Australia, New Zealand, and also from Canada. The Japanese 32nd Army was actually based on Okinawa, some 77,000 troops, along with 9,000 Imperial Japanese Navy troops that were located at the Oroku Naval Base that you see here marked on this map, which is towards the southern end of the island. Plus, the Japanese had also trained an additional 40,000 civilian conscripts, or at least they convinced 40,000 people who usually had no choice to join them in what became their suicidal defense of the island. The Japanese had been employing kamikazes since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which had already occurred from 6 months previous to this. But between the April 1st invasion and May 25th of 1945, there were an additional 7 major kamikaze attacks involving more than 1,500 planes, all attacking the American forces on Okinawa. Controlling the battle from the Japanese side were these 3 men. In southern Okinawa, General Mitsuru Ushijima, his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isami Cho, and his chief of operations, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, argued about how best to proceed. Yahara argued the best strategy would be a defensive strategy. Let the Americans come to them, and they would attack them from their hidden positions. Cho, on the other hand, thought it best to aggressively attack the Americans. In the north, Colonel Udo was also in command. In addition to these people, the man who was in charge of the whole defense of the island was Rear Admiral Minoru Ota, and he was in charge of everything there. He expected the Americans to land with between 6 to 10 divisions against the Japanese garrison of what was then 2.5 divisions. His staff calculated that superior quality and numbers of weapons gave each U.S. division 5 or 6 times the firepower of a Japanese division. To this, of course, would be added the Americans' abundant naval and air power. Despite all of this, the idea of surrendering never entered their minds. In fact, they went in the opposite direction. They conscripted 1,800 middle school boys aged 14 to 17 for frontline service. The military ordered schools to force all students to volunteer as soldiers. And I say volunteer, I say that in quotes, volunteer as soldiers. Sometimes they even counterfeited the necessary documents because most of these kids were really young. About half the kids were killed, most in suicide bomb attacks against American tanks and fighting in guerrilla operations. Just all part of the carnage. Both male and female kids from 21 secondary schools were also pressed into service. 2,000 more lives tossed away for essentially nothing. The girls acted mainly as nurses, but with no real front lines, they too were being killed all the time. There was just nowhere to go. After losing the Battle of Okinawa, interestingly enough, the Japanese government enacted new laws to prepare for the upcoming battle on the home islands. These laws shockingly made it possible for boys aged 15 or older and girls aged 17 or older to actually be drafted into frontline service. Perhaps you're getting the picture. They actually had absolutely no intention whatsoever of surrendering, which brings us to the man offshore who was ultimately in charge of Task Force 58, Ray Spruance, who was deployed east of Okinawa with 8 destroyers serving as picket ships and 13 aircraft carriers with more than 1,500 other ships, including the battleship Texas. Now, it's difficult for people to sit here in Texas these days and picture the power of the U.S. Navy by this time of the war. 13 aircraft carriers is simply a shocking testament to the willpower of America to pay any price whatsoever to bring this war to a successful conclusion. This is 13 of the 26 that were built were taken to Okinawa. The British came on the scene with their own fleet. Assigned to Task Force 57, which was what Spruance called his fleet, they arrived with 10 of their own smaller carriers and remained off Sakashima Islands to protect the southern flank of the invasion. There was not going to be a Leyte Gulf type incident, which had been a real problem during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which we all learned about last week. This was not going to be allowed at Okinawa. Now, the battle went on for such an extended period of time with such terrible losses that Nimitz took the unprecedented step of rotating out the main naval commanders so that they could rest from the battle. So the fleet designation changed under these different commanders, as we learned last week. The U.S. naval forces started out the fight as the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Spruance, but when Halsey arrived and took over the fleet, it was renamed the Third Fleet. So this command change occurred right in the middle of the battle, as opposed to what they usually did was wait until the end of one battle before they would make the change. The Japanese Air Force began to react to the invasion after 5 days of initial pounding from offshore. On April the 6th, they attacked with 400 planes flying in from both the Japanese home islands and from Taiwan, or Formosa, as it was called. By April the 30th, 20 American ships were sunk, 157 more heavily damaged by any enemy action. And by this time, the Japanese had already lost more than 1,100 planes. From April the 6th to June 22nd, the Japanese sent nearly 1,500 kamikazes, with roughly half coming from the home island of Kyushu, which is the southern Japanese island, and the other half coming from Formosa. Particularly hard hit were these U.S. radar picket ships that were well away from the overwhelming firepower of the main battle fleet and are placed at the edge of the fleet with their radars on so that they could detect incoming ships. Despite this, both the carriers Franklin and Bunker Hill, which we know suffered massive casualties during the battle, were unable to withstand the kamikaze attacks. Between the two carriers, 1,500 men were lost. And as we know, both of these carriers were knocked out of the war permanently. Suicide motorboats were also showing up. Even suicide ships were showing up that would slam into the sides of the U.S. ships. The Japanese were going to throw everything they had at the U.S., including their largest remaining battleship, which was at the time this ship here, pictured here, the battleship Yamato. On April the 5th, the Japanese dispatched 10 of their remaining surface ships from Kyushu, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and under the direction of Admiral Ito. Their plan, shockingly, was to try to fight through the swarm of American naval forces and drive all the ships up onto the beach in Okinawa, and then use the naval cannons as field guns. Talk about desperate. Their crews were supposed to join the fighting forces on Okinawa. The force was spotted, however, by U.S. subs just after leaving Kyushu and was intercepted by an overwhelming American force of U.S. carriers. In just 2 hours, and under a withering attack from 300 carrier-based planes, the Yamato was sent to the bottom. April the 7th was a very good day for U.S. forces. Along with the Yamato, an additional 10 ships were sent to the bottom, along with the admiral and 3,700 other sailors. U.S. losses were just 10 aircraft and 12 men. Now the British showed up with their fleet and its flagship, the HMS Indefatigable. Wow, that's a tough name to say. The British, by the way, interestingly, had interesting names like this for all of their ships, as opposed to American ships, which were usually named after places or, in some cases, people. The British fleet spent from March 26th to April 10th making sure that no Japanese planes could attack the fleet from Sakishima Islands, which you see here in its location, stuck between Formosa, or Taiwan as we call it now, and this here is actually Okinawa. So they were hanging out here at the Sakishima Islands, making sure that no kamikazes were flying from Formosa, trying to interdict them before they could reach Okinawa. After April the 10th, they moved directly to Formosa to help go after the kamikazes that were flying from hidden positions on the island. The British stayed off Formosa for the rest of the battle, where they were continually under attack by these kamikazes. Several attacks caused significant damage, but the Royal Navy carriers had an innovative advantage over their U.S. counterparts. The Brits had designed their carriers earlier in the war to include flight decks that, while the U.S. carriers were made out of wooden flight decks, the flight decks of the British carriers were actually reinforced steel decks. Why the difference in design? Well, U.S. designers thought that repairs to the flight decks would be easier if they were just made from planks of wood. If a hole was knocked in the wood, you rip out the planks, you put in new planks, you're back in business. Now, there was another reason for it, and that was that when the U.S. carriers were designed, no one had ever heard of a kamikaze. To add an armored deck would have dramatically increased the weight of the ship way above the center line. Remember, we had that discussion last week about the problem that American carriers had with the center of gravity being high, which caused the ship to roll even more. Well, armoring the flight deck and making it out of steel would have added even more weight to these U.S. carriers and made them even more unstable. So this is why the U.S. settled for adding all of the gun tubs around the flight deck, which were designed to shoot down the kamikazes and live with that weight penalty, rather than add a heavily armored plated deck. So their design style was slightly different than the British. The result was that it was easier for a kamikaze that survived the hail of gunfire to crash right through the wooden decks to explode below on the hangar decks. The British carriers were of a newer design, where the armored flight deck was part of the original design. So the British carriers were all reinforced steel decks, and they actually had this ability to withstand the kamikazes. It worked so well that the British carriers were able to put themselves back in service after putting out the fire after the kamikaze hit the deck. Unlike the American counterparts, the British did not need to carry as many anti-aircraft guns mounted at the flight deck level, so most of their carriers arrived in the Pacific with few anti-aircraft guns, unlike the American carriers. And there was another reason for this. These carriers that the British built were designed for service in Europe. And in Europe, German Luftwaffe pilots had no desire to turn themselves into kamikazes. So they were not slamming their way into the British ships as was happening in Japan. A difference in the style between the fanatical Japanese and the Germans. On March 26th, the land battle began with the 77th ID landing on the Kurama Islands that you see here off the southern coast, 15 miles west of Okinawa. After 5 days of tough fighting, the islands were secure with only 27 dead and 81 wounded, while the Japanese dead counted at about 650. The purpose of taking these islands was to provide a protected anchorage for the fleet's vast array of supply ships. So these islands had the ability to have enough space for an anchorage, and the high cliffs on the islands themselves allowed the American military to put enough guns where they thought they could protect the supply ships. The main battle began on April the 1st, 1945, with the Marines landing unopposed on Nagano Island, just 8 miles west of the Okinawan capital of Naha. So the capital of Okinawa, Naha, is here, and they started the fight by attacking these islands right here. The Marines unloaded an artillery battalion of 155 millimeter guns called Long Toms. These would cover the main landings on Okinawa. Ernie Pyle, who many of you have heard of, was a famous war correspondent. He went ashore here at Nagano Island, and it was here that he was killed in a firefight with the Japanese defenders of the island on April the 2nd of 1945. The main landings were made by the 24th Corps and the 3rd Amphibious Corps on the Hagushi beaches on the western coast of Okinawa on April the 1st. The 10th Army swept across the south-central part of the island with relative ease, capturing the Kadena and Yomitan air bases within hours of the landing. Due to the lighter than expected opposition, and with the island effectively split in two, General Buckner decided to proceed immediately with Phase 2, the seizure of the northern part of the island. The 6th Marine Division headed up the Ishikawa Bismuth, and by April the 7th had pretty much sealed off this Matobu Peninsula that you see here. 6 days later, on April the 13th, the 2nd Battalion of the 22nd Marine Regiment reached the northern tip of Okinawa, here at Hito Point. This left the remaining Japanese forces in the north bottled up on this Matobu Peninsula. Here, the terrain was very mountainous and very wooded, a twisted mass of rocky ravines and ridges on the center of the peninsula. It took 5 days to clear the Matobu Peninsula, which took until April the 18th before the fighting there was finally over. While the 6th Marine Division, we'll just pick up where we left off. While the 6th Marine Division cleared northern Okinawa, the U.S. Army's 96th and 7th turned south. The 96th began to encounter fierce resistance in west central Okinawa from Japanese troops, along what is known as Highway 1 and about 5 miles northwest of Shuri, which is a castle in the center of the southern part of the island. This became known as Cactus Ridge. The 7th Infantry Division encountered fierce fighting from a position known as the Pinnacle that you see here on this slide. By the night of April the 8th, American troops had cleared these areas with an additional 1,500 men killed and capturing about 4,500 Japanese. Things were just, however, getting started at this point. The next American objective was Kakazu Ridge, 2 hills with a connecting ridge. The Japanese found the Marines and forced the Marines and GIs to pay for every foot of progress. They fought tenaciously with small groups hidden in fortified caves. Each cave had to be first found and then cleared. Each cave was a costly battle. Every foot of progress was contested. The Japanese sent Okinawans at gunpoint out to obtain food and water and supplies, which led to an immense number of civilian casualties. There was no stopping the American advance, but the price in blood was becoming more and more outrageous. You may remember the recent movie, Hacksaw Ridge, about the conscientious objector, Desmond Doss, who you see here pictured in this picture. He was a combat medic who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, saving 75 men. Oh, are we lost again here? Hang on. This is Richard. Oh, sorry, I need to call you back. Totally different subject. All right, so I guess we're still in business. Good. Wow, technical difficulties today like mad. All right. As the American assault went on against the Kakuzu Ridge stalled, Lieutenant General Ushijima, influenced by General Cho, decided to go on the offensive. On the evening of the 12th, the 32nd Army attacked American positions along the entire front. The Japanese attack was heavy, sustained, and well organized. After close combat, the attackers retreated, but they came back the following night, and again the night after that, and the night after that again. Ushijima took 2 lessons from this. The first one, offensive actions against superiority of U.S. forces was hopeless, and the second was that night attacks fared better than day attacks. So, of course, they only started attacking at night. The 27th Infantry Division took over the fight on April the 9th under John Hodge. He had 3 divisions of 15,000 men on the line, the 27th, the 7th, and the 96th. Each was holding a front of only about 1.5 miles. So let's do the math. 1.5 miles is 5,280 feet. 1.5 miles is basically 7,500 feet. There were 15,000 men for every 7,500 feet. That's 2 men per foot. Think of that. 2 men for every foot of space on the line. That's how many Americans were fighting in that battle. On April the 19th, they all attacked, and it began with a barrage from 324 artillery guns, the largest ever in the Pacific Ocean theater. If this sounds a little like what things sounded like in World War I, you'd be 100% correct. This is what was going on in Okinawa. It descended into a battle, the likes of which hadn't been seen since World War I. In addition to the 324 field guns, count battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all joining in the bombardment, which was followed by 650 Navy and Marine planes attacking the enemy positions with napalm, rockets, bombs, and machine guns. The fighting was intense. The Japanese defenses were located on reverse slopes, where the defenders waited out the artillery barrage and aerial attack in relative safety, emerging from the caves to rain mortar rounds and grenades upon the Americans who were advancing up the forward slope. Another type of thing that was happening all the time in World War I. A tank assault to achieve a breakthrough failed with a loss of 22 American tanks. Flamethrower tanks were brought in to clear cave defenses. No breakthrough was possible. The 24th Corps suffered 720 dead in just one night. One night of fighting. At the end of April, the Army forces had finally pushed past these defensive lines to the Machinado defensive line. And at this point, The 1st Marine Division relieved the 27th Infantry Division, and the 77th ID relieved the 96th. Corps took over the Marines took over the right flank, and also the 10th Army took over on the left flank. Marines and soldiers were becoming exhausted with just 1 or 2 days on the line. After 1 or 2 days, they had to be rotated out. On May the 4th, the Japanese launched a major counterattack. This time, Ushijima attempted to make an amphibious landing behind the American lines, like the Americans tried to do at Anzio in Italy. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they brought with them a heavy amount of artillery, which they tried to use against the American lines. But by this time, American artillery counter-battery fire was so strong that the Japanese guns were almost immediately knocked out. As such, the landing failed, and the Japanese lost most of their artillery. From May 11th onwards, Buckner launched another American attack. 10 days of fierce fighting followed. On the 13th, the 96th ID and the 763rd Tank Battalion captured something called Conical Hill in on the southern Yonabaru coast. There was similarly a place that looked like Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. It was defended by 1,000 Japanese, who were all lost. Meanwhile, on the opposite coast, the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions fought for Sugarloaf Hill. The capture of these two key positions exposed the Japanese around Shuri on both sides. Buckner hoped to envelop Shuri Castle and trap the main Japanese defending forces there. By the end of May, monsoon rains had turned contested hills and roads into a morass, made much worse by both the tactical and medical situations. Here we go with more World War I conditions, muck and mud. The wounded couldn't be easily evacuated. Troops were living amongst the rotting dead, the garbage, human waste, and filth. Unburied Americans and Japanese bodies were everywhere. Which brings us to Shuri Castle. On May 29th, Major Pedro Del Val, commander of the 1st Marine Division, ordered Captain Julian Dusenbury of Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines to capture the castle. Seizure of the castle represented both strategic and psychological blows for the Japanese and was a milestone in the ending of the campaign. Del Val would be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his leadership in the fight and the subsequent work that he did in the occupation after the fight was over. Captain Dusenbury would later receive the Navy Cross for his actions. Shuri Castle had been shelled by the battleship USS Mississippi for 3 days before this advance. The Mississippi had been in the Atlantic on December the 7th, 1941, but set sail for the Pacific on December the 9th, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. She spent the entire war in the Pacific, playing a role in many of the island invasions. In this case, they fired more than 3,000 rounds from her 18-inch guns on Shuri Castle. You can imagine how much of the castle was left by the time they were done. And by the time the Marines attacked it, the carnage there was already immense. Now, the Japanese managed to skillfully, however, retreat from Shuri even further south. 30,000 troops lived on to fight another day, and they formed a new defensive line down in the Kion Peninsula at the southern end of the island. This ultimately led to the greatest slaughter in the battle. On June 4th, the Marines launched an amphibious assault on the peninsula. 4,000 sailors, all at the naval headquarters, including the admiral in charge, committed suicide on the same day at the same time. By June 17th, all that was left of Ushijima's 32nd Army were bottled up in a very small pocket in the south end of the island. And at that point, on June 18th, General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery fire while monitoring progress of his troops from a forward observation post. Buckner was replaced by Roy Geiger, and upon assuming command, Geiger, interestingly, became the only U.S. Marine to ever command a U.S. Army in the field in combat. But his job only lasted for 5 days because the Army brought in General Joseph Stilwell from Burma. You might remember me talking about him last week. He was known as Vinegar Joe. Made tough as nails from fighting in Burma, even he was shocked at the carnage of Okinawa. The trees were all missing, the buildings all destroyed, and there were dead everywhere. This was not jungle fighting. This was fighting now on a barren wasteland, the World War II equivalent of the Battle of the Somme from World War I. And it never ended. It just went on and on and on. Just one day after Buckner was killed on June 19th, General Claudius Miller Isley, the commander of the U.S. Army 96th Infantry Division, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire while touring the front. Buckner was the highest-ranking American killed in combat in the Pacific, and Isley was the second highest-ranking general killed in the Pacific. Even generals on Okinawa had to learn to keep their heads down. The last remnants of the organized Japanese resistance came about on June 21st. Ushijima and Cho committed suicide. Yahara asked to commit suicide, but Ushijima asked him to live on so he could tell the story of the battle. Yahara would do so and wrote a book about the Battle of Okinawa. This and a book about Midway written by Commander Genda are two of the only Japanese books ever translated into English about the war from the Japanese side. Now, fighting on Okinawa continued past the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fighting continued even past August 15th, when the emperor announced that Japan was quitting the war. It continued until after the official surrender ceremony on the deck of the Missouri on September the 2nd, 1945. In fact, the Japanese only officially surrendered on Okinawa on September the 7th, 5 days after the surrender, and they did so near Kadena Airfield. This is how fanatic they were. The World War I fighting conditions on Okinawa caused immense mental health issues for the sailors, airmen, Marines, and Army guys all on the island and around the island. The constant bombardment from artillery and mortars was awful. The mud, the disease, the death made the place hell on earth. Dead Marines were everywhere. Proper burials were just not possible. The brutality and desecration of American dead by Japanese soon became commonplace on both sides. But the tactic by the Japanese of using Okinawans, especially kids, as human shields was a new level of terror and torment for Marines and GIs alike. The best thing we can say about the Battle of Okinawa is that it finally came to an end. And in doing so, there were 24 Medal of Honor recipients from the Battle of Okinawa. What's interesting about that? Well, first of all, during all of World War II, the United States issued out 472 Medals of Honor to recipients. With 24 of them on Okinawa, that's 1 in 20. 5% of all Medals of Honor were issued to men who were in the fighting on Okinawa. And you can see one name you'll recognize is Desmond Doss, who was in that movie Hacksaw Ridge, made famous by Clint Eastwood. So this is where I thought we would end today's seminar. We next week are going to talk about the Japanese and the end of the war. In doing so, the title for next week's seminar I thought was interesting. I tried to make it interesting. As you might know, World War I is famous for having ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And so for the title of next week's seminar, I'm using the title the 12th hour of the 15th day of the 8th month, which is the day the war came to a close in August of 1945. But unlike the end of World War I, where a new world war would begin just a few years later, the world has not seen another war like World War II, which really ended on the 15th of August of 1945. It could be that people realized that if there was going to be a third world war, then the fourth world war would likely be fought with sticks and stones. We're going to talk about that next week. And so at this point, sorry about the technical problems, but let's open it up to questions and answer some of your questions.
Well, things happen, Richard, but Mary asks, were there any other Allied troops fighting at Okinawa?
Only in the Navy. The British had showed up there with their fleet, and with them there were Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians, but they did not see action on the island itself. I'm not aware of any other Allied troops actually landing on on the island itself.
Harvey would like to know, does the U.S. still have a significant presence in Okinawa?
Well, yes, we do. This is an enduring part of this battle, is that so much blood was spilled that the American military decided that they were going to not give it up. And so we still to this day have several large bases for the Marines on Okinawa, and also there's air bases and also naval bases there, which we are using to patrol the South China Sea and the area around Japan. Of course, this is part of the ongoing disputes with in the area with the Chinese, but we've been there since World War II, and of course during Korean, this was a very active place to be. But of course, since then there's been a lot less activity. Our presence on Okinawa has shrunk over the years. The Okinawans have grown to sort of resent the presence of American troops. Of course, Okinawa is now a very crowded modern island like the rest of Japan. The American bases are sort of taking up very expensive real estate, which the Okinawans would like to get back. On the other hand, I don't think the American military is particularly interested in giving up that presence. Much of the presence, however, has been reduced over the years in places like Guam, another island taken during the Second World War, have become a much larger U.S. military naval bases in the Pacific, Guam being much less populated than Okinawa. Unfortunately, it's a lot further from the centers of population in the South China Sea area. We're making Guam less valuable as a base rather than Okinawa.
Paul wonders, was the fight to the death culture of the Japanese soldiers in World War II a long-standing attitude going back to feudal times in Japan, or was it a more recent development?
Well, in fact, it was a throwback to this Bushido code, which had grown out of the samurai in the 17th and 18th centuries. But when Japan modernized, remember the first seminar we talked about the Meiji Empire and Emperor Meiji, who came along and tried to modernize the country. They tried to move away from this type of mentality and did so for the period up until World War I. But after World War I, these feudal ideas of Bushido and honor and seppuku and ritual suicide and dying for the emperor, this became a focus of the Japanese military that was in command of the War Council, as we discussed in the first seminar. So they sort of brought this culture back at during the 20s and 30s after World War I, and it grew and grew until it became the ferocious, nasty central theme of the Japanese that we saw in World War II.
Jim asks, what is Okinawa like today?
So I was in Okinawa probably 15 years ago. It's a very modern island. There are actually some very nice beaches and resorts there. Very populated place. Quite a few Japanese live there. There's a large industrial base there. It's a quite crowded place, much like Japan itself, compared to places like Texas, obviously. The trees have all grown back. There's a lot of plaques and memorials around for where the Americans were fighting. American divisions that fought there went there after the war and built memorials to all the men that were killed. You really can't get over how it affects somebody when hundreds of their buddies are killed on a place like that. And so after the war, a lot of memorials were built. They're still there. You can visit as many of them as you possibly could. There's probably more of them been built than you could probably visit in 2 weeks of constant visits to these places. But those memorials will be there forever. The Japanese are very respectful of that situation, although they do kind of resent the fact that the Americans have these large bases on the island, and it's a source of some ongoing protests from time to time. But the island, like the rest of Japan, has become a very modern country.
Alexis says, my father was assistant engineer officer on the USS Cross. I believe he saw action in Okinawa. Is that correct? He never spoke of his naval experience. Now I know why.
Yes, well, I've never heard of I don't know the story of the USS Cross. Of course, there were, as I said, hundreds of ships that were there. The Cross, not being a major capital ship, is one whose name I don't know. I tell you what I will do, though, is I'll look up the history of that ship and try to talk about it next week. It's always interesting to look these things up and see what role they played at Okinawa, and maybe they participated in some other interesting battles during the war. I'll report back. Let me make a note about that. It's always fun to look these things up.
Thank you. Next question, James would like to know, switching from the 5th to the 3rd Fleet seems like it must have caused confusion on the American side.
Well, it did, but it really was causing more confusion on the Japanese side, because when it first started, they really thought there were two fleets, because they didn't really understand it was the same ships, just commanded by a different group. So when it first started, I'm sure the Japanese were pretty confused and thought, wow, they really have a lot of ships out here, because of course, we have two different fleets. But I'm sure after a period of time, they figured it out, and it was really just a way for the United States to share the command amongst these different commanders. And without dividing the force in half. They most definitely did not want to divide the fleet in half. Why? Because they did not want a situation where one of these fleets could be overwhelmed in some sort of a surprise by some unlikely situation that they wouldn't be aware of, but the possibility of a Japanese attack that might overwhelm one of these fleets was always first and foremost in their minds. So they didn't want to divide the fleet. So their entire purpose was to keep this giant fleet together so that it basically could overwhelm anything that it was up against. And of course, this worked perfectly. The Japanese really, as their forces shrank and shrank, had less and less to fight with, and this became an even more dominating feature of the war. And so there was really no effort at all to divide that fleet, which they could have done between Halsey and Spruance, but they just were insisting, Nimitz was insisting on keeping the whole thing together.
You asked, have you visited the multinational military graveyard on Okinawa containing both Japanese, American, and other Allied graves?
Unfortunately, the day that we were going to do that, it was pouring cats and dogs, and so we never made it there. So no, I have not. One day I'll get back to Okinawa, and I visited a lot of American cemeteries, but that's one I've not managed to get to. So no, I haven't. I love visiting those places, primarily I like looking for people from Texas, wandering through and seeing if there are people that whose names I might recognize. It's one of the fun things that sort of reminds me, it connects you to the time. And of course, these people don't get many visitors. So I think it's important when you can to go visit not only those battlefields in the Pacific, but the ones in Europe as well. I think I get something out of it. And I think most people would, if they spent the time, get something out of spending some time doing that.
Steve asked, did the Japanese Navy have the same belief in fighting to the end, or was this fight to the death attitude mostly in the Army? Also, did the Japanese public agree with fighting to the death?
Well, okay, so let's unpack that. So first of all, the Japanese Navy, remember I talked 2 weeks ago about how they put the emblem of the emperor on the front of almost every capital ship that they had. And the impact of that was that the commanders of those ships were very hesitant to send their ship to the bottom of the ocean. And so this tended to make the commanders of these large capital ships somewhat less aggressive than you might otherwise expect the Japanese to have been. So there were a number of instances when the Japanese withdrew from an attack, even when they shouldn't have, like at Leyte Gulf, because they were worried that they might lose the ship, which would be an affront to the emperor, because of course having his chrysanthemum on the front of the ship was like having himself on the ship, and so they didn't want to lose it. So in a sense, this sort of tempered their enthusiasm for suicide runs with these ships. So in that sense, this kept them from being nearly as aggressive as the banzai charges that you saw on land. What was the second part of the question?
Hold on. What did the Japanese public feel about
right.
fight
Yes,
to
the
the
Japanese.
death?
Well, this is okay. So the clues that we have about that we could see on Saipan and Okinawa, where you had ethnic Japanese who were participating in the fighting, leaping to their death rather than surrender, and generally thinking that to surrender was an affront to the emperor, and therefore they became, in many cases, willingly human bullets, as they were described. One can only assume that this would have carried on in the home islands, where they were even more fanatical than they probably were on these outer islands, where influences of being away from the home islands probably would normally have had some effect on them. So it's reasonable to assume that had the invasion of Japan occurred, the Japanese on the home islands would have been, the civilians would have been fighting right along with the military, the men, the women, the children. It would have been, as I've said, a total bloodbath, way worse than anything you could ever possibly imagine.
Joaline says she was a toddler in the mid-50s when her dad was stationed at Tachikawa Air Force Base in post-war Japan. She wonders if the U.S. still maintains a military presence there at Tachikawa.
What's it called again?
Tachikawa, I think.
Tachikawa. This is not the name of one of the Japanese bases that I'm familiar with. But it's possible. You know, I'm familiar with some of the names of the bases around Tokyo, but this one I've never heard of before. I'd have to look that up. If you send me the spelling, I'll try to figure that out. But it's not a name that's familiar to me.
Tachikawa.
Okay, ACH.
Tachikawa. Air
Okay,
Force Base. That was in post-war Japan.
Right. Well, we'll see if it's still there. I'll have to go look.
Barbara asks, have you read the 2 translated books written by the Japanese? If so, what was your reaction to the books?
Genda's book. I've read Genda's book. I've not read the other book. I haven't been able to find the other book. That's a problem. Some of them are hard to find. But Genda's book was really interesting. He gave a rather unvarnished view of the errors that were made by Japan at Midway. He was very glowing in his references to Yamamoto. He was Yamamoto's planning officer, so he was very important to the Japanese and had been really responsible for much of the planning for Pearl Harbor. But he survived the war. He spent some time in prison, but then he did go on to write this book after the war. And actually, it's a paperback. Well, maybe it's a hardcover somewhere, but the version I have is a paperback, and I was able to find it on Amazon, so you can find it. Quite worth reading.
Jim and Rita want to know approximately how big was the U.S. fleet at the end of the war, the number of carriers, battleships, etc.
So we had, if you recall from the presentation the other week, there were 26 fleet-sized aircraft carriers that were available to the U.S. Navy by the end of the war. There were 6 more that were in construction that were never used because the war ended before they brought them into service. Several of them were scrapped before they were finished. In addition to those carriers, of course, that was just one ship. There were in the U.S. Navy more than 5,000 ships by the time World War II ended, of all sizes. Now, of the larger battleships, we had roughly 20 battleships that between the ones that were brought up off the bottom of Pearl Harbor, plus new ones that were built, plus ones that were not damaged at Pearl Harbor. There were about 20 of them. Hundreds of cruisers like the Indianapolis, and probably 300 destroyers by the time we were done, and countless other smaller ships. So we had a huge fleet, immense fleet in the Pacific. Not to mention the fleet that we had in the Atlantic. You know, we ended up with a very large fleet in the Atlantic as well, chasing U-boats towards the end of the war. So you know, we just had overwhelming military might, both in the ocean, under the ocean with submarines, as well as, of course, especially maybe with the Air Force, which, you know, Roosevelt announced just the day after Pearl Harbor an ambitious plan to build 50,000 planes during World War II. Well, what he failed to recognize is that we'd build 50,000 planes in 1945 alone. 1945, when the war ended, you know, in August. So it wasn't even a full year, and we built 50,000 planes. For the whole war, we built around 400,000 planes. I mean, it's just immense number of planes and ships, tanks, 100,000, more than 100,000 tanks that we built during World War II. These were numbers that no one could keep up with. Of course, we had the lucky advantage that our factories were not being bombed. Of course, we also had an abundant situation where we had abundant natural resources. We had endless amounts of steel, copper, everything you needed in order to build all these weapons. And we had the industrial power to do so. And it of course, made the difference. Also, the ability to raise the capital to be able to pay for it all. You know, most of it was paid for with war bonds raised from the public. So there was not much national debt. Only 10% of the war was funded with national debt. The rest was all funded with war bonds. So about $300 billion to fund World War II, $30 billion in national debt, $270 billion in war bonds. And if you recall the atomic bomb presentation that I made in the spring, 30 billion, 10% of it was spent building the atomic bomb and all the factories that were necessary in order to build that weapon. So, you know, we really spent money, a great deal of money to bring about the successful conclusion of the war. But, you know, it was actually not so much the money, but the endless number of people who worked tirelessly in the United States, day and night, in many cases, to build all that stuff. Men, women, old people, everybody went to work to help the war effort. And this was really an entire nation that went to war.
It's wearing me out. All that money and effort. This is your Q&A moderator calling time. We are at the end.
Wait a minute, Anita.
There's one more question,
please. Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Ron would like to know, you mentioned that the Yamato was a suicide mission. Would you expand on that?
Yeah, so they had this very clever idea that they would leave Kyushu with the Yamato and its fleet, break through the lines, and literally drive the Yamato up onto the beach on Okinawa and use the guns, which were quite large, to help fire away at the enemy, meaning the Americans. But you know, these plans were such an act of desperation, because by the time the Yamato set sail from Kyushu, the Americans had total control of the sky. They had total control of the ocean. So how the Yamato thought at that time they were going to make it all the way from Kyushu to Okinawa was kind of hard to understand. You know, they were spotted immediately sailing from Kyushu, and as I mentioned in this lecture today, they were within 24 hours on the bottom of the ocean. It was sending out battleships without air cover to get rid of the enemy's planes was really a suicide mission. It really had no hope of success. And of course, the U.S. had plenty of aircraft carriers and naval aviation assets to to send the Yamato to the bottom, along with 10 or 15 of the other ships that went along with it. They all ended up on the bottom, and they had no hope of making it the 300 miles or 350 miles from Kyushu to Okinawa. There's just no chance, no way.
One final question. Anita would like to know, were there Japanese war criminals tried and executed, or did they all commit suicide?
So next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the war crimes trials after the war. You know, just like in Germany, we had the Nuremberg trials, and in the Pacific, we also had trials that occurred in Tokyo after the war. There were also war crimes trials in the Philippines and on several of the islands where there were Japanese captured. The number of Japanese that were put to death was far less than in Germany because of various reasons, which we're going to talk a little bit about next week. But of the Class A war criminals in Japan, I think there were 200 or 300 Class A war criminals that put to death in Japan, but there were several thousand Class A war criminals put to death in Germany. So the punishment was meted out to a much greater extent in Europe than it was in the Pacific. The war crimes trials in the Pacific were incredibly complicated. You know, in Europe, there were judges from Russia, from the United States, and from Italy. Usually it was the main war crimes trials anyway, had 3 judges. Sorry, Russia, Britain, and the United States. But in the Pacific, there were like 12 or 13 judges who were sitting on the war crimes tribunal because there were so many other countries. There was the Philippines, there was Indonesia, there was the Dutch, there was the Chinese. They all had a judge at the tribunals, and it was a much more cumbersome affair than it was in Europe, and it was a considerable amount of chaos. In fact, there's a very good series on the war crimes trials in the Pacific on Amazon, the Amazon streaming service that I watched. I'll add that to my reading list because it's actually they did quite a good job of it, and I really enjoyed watching it. But it's a good summary of all the trouble that they had trying to bring the Japanese to justice. Let's not forget there's an Australian judge, a Canadian judge, a New Zealand judge. Just think of all the countries that were involved in the Pacific, and it just got very unwieldy. Of course, on top of all of that, you also had the Russians who were causing trouble, and there was an attempt on the part of the Allies to curry favor with the Japanese. So we needed their assistance to help counter the threat of the Russians. So the United States sort of went easy on the Japanese, given their despicable behavior. You know, they could have been punished far more severely than they were. For instance, we never did try the emperor for war crimes, even though there was a very good reason to have done so. He got away with it. We're going to talk more about that next week, so we'll pick that up next week.
Thank you, Richard. And we look forward to week 6, the 12th hour of the 18th day of something. I missed the last part.
Sorry about the technical problems, and we'll pick it up next week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Take care, everybody.